Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for the introduction. I have been back in the UK about 18 months. I lived in Singapore 8 years. So I've worked in about 20 different countries, 4 different continents. But it all turns out it's pretty much the same sort of approaches, same patterns, the same things. When it gets down to it, it's just slightly different in slightly different contexts. So I'm going to talk about what I think is a keystone, the core element that holds agility together in organizations. And if you don't have it, it's a really tough slog, in my experience, to try and keep going, to go back and forth, put in lots of energy, and disband and regroup, and so on and so forth. So I want to talk about what I consider the keystone, which is Agile Leadership. So how many people here would consider themselves a leader? About half, I would say. So let's see if that changes over the next 20 or 30 minutes. Because the context in which we think of ourselves as a leader or our identity changes as we go. So, my first attempt at introducing agility to organization was my own organization, a small startup in finance, about 2002. I just read Extreme Programming Explained, thought this answers lots of questions I thought had answers, and here they are all laid out. So I went to my director, my technical director, said we should be doing unit testing, we should be doing this, let's get on and do these things. And he said, well, you can do it if you want to, but I'm not. And that wasn't good enough for me. I thought, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I should be making these decisions. And I was not following what I later read in the Agile Manifesto, that first paragraph. We are uncovering better ways. I was doing it by reading about it, not doing it, and telling other people we should be doing it. And that caused resistance. And if you're familiar with some of the neuroscience out there, the things that cause us to resist, the things that cause us to be fearful are threats perceived by the brain. They used to be a key to our survival. Now they're more social threats. Am I going to look embarrassed? Am I going to get demoted? Am I going to whatever it might be? So these threats to our status, our certainty, our autonomy, relatedness, how comfortable or familiar we are with things, and how we think things are fair or not, all can trigger threat responses in us, which tend to make us fight against them, fly from them, or just do nothing, just freeze. Our brain has some standard patterns. What we tend to call biases are shortcuts the brain has created. We commonly call them heuristics. And so we make ourselves comfortable. We create ourselves an identity or an ego, and we try and protect it to reassure us of who we are. If we're not sure about what the future will hold, if we're presented with something that we don't know, we're not certain about, we tend to create a situation where we can be right, where we can be comfortable in knowing. We tell ourselves these stories. Even though we know we're not right, we're happy that the story is right. It makes us feel comfortable. And I lived in Singapore for 8 years, as I said. They have a very low tolerance for uncertainty. Out of 100, they rate 8 on the Power Distance Index, where most countries are somewhere between 30, 40, 50, 60. For many of the scores, Singapore rates 8. And it often comes from their position in the world, their short life span as a country. They're only 50-something years old. And all these things apply to all of us, right? And to me, Agile leadership isn't overcoming these biases. It's not trying not to be threatened, but it's accepting that we are threatened by them. And a lot of the Agile approaches we have that are effective are ways of acknowledging that these exist and finding ways to work with them, actually to use them to our advantage, or more commonly to work in teams. where we have the diversity of many biases or many different heuristics, and then we bring all that diversity together and all those strengths come together and the weaknesses fade into the background. And so when I asked you, are you leaders? We tend to think, am I an individual leader? And just the way that we work in teams for developing products and for working in uncertain environments, leadership also benefits from working in teams. And I don't see that in many organizations. I see a leadership team. I gave a leadership course about 3 months ago for a company in Cambridge, and they had a leadership team of 35 people who didn't meet very often. They had a position where they got paid a bit more for being in the leadership team, but they didn't really do anything different. They felt ineffective. And that was 35 people in one department of a large organization. So when we say leadership, when we say leadership team, it's quite vague in many organizations what that actually means. So these defensive mind traps and these threats will come up repeatedly through the next 20 minutes or so. Every time we see them, it's an indication that something we're doing is pushing people away, is causing people to disengage, because the way we approach things doesn't invite change, doesn't welcome and respect and give people a choice. So what is Agile leadership? Is it another one of those oxymorons that we hear bandied about? Agile project manager, business analyst. Just add Agile to the front or back of something. Even your tools, we add Agile to the end of it, and suddenly it's allowed to be purchased by the procurement department. We give it to everyone to reduce the cost per head, and we're Agile in some form. I don't think it is, but I think this sort of response to what Agile is, this renaming of my role as Agile something, is just another response to the threat that we have. It's unfamiliar, we don't know what it is, so we'll just name it. We'll feel certain about what it is now. I feel comfortable because I can relate to it. It's Agile, but it's my familiar role, and we'll carry on as we were. And so a lot of the acting Agile, saying we're doing it, is a lot more common than we might hope, because it's just how our brain responds, particularly when we're in a very hierarchical organization, one where we require lots of people to make decisions for anything to happen. It's just easier to go along and say what fits, what's expected, and not create any real change, which would threaten lots of other people. A friend of mine worked in the NHS, and about 5 years ago, he was very frustrated that whenever he had anything to do that was new and exciting, his immediate response, his response that he received from everyone was, no, we're not doing that. And it took him a long while to realize that they couldn't do anything by themselves. They would need other people to help, and they would need other people to help. And they all said no, because they realized, I'm going to have to get someone else, and then they're going to have to get someone else. So the dependency line was quite large. So the easiest thing for everyone to say was no in the beginning. And that's how we get large bureaucratic organizations, where it's very difficult to change anything from within the bowels, within the sort of middle or lower areas. Of course, we do get it higher up. I just talked to someone just now who says, we're going through a reorg. And a reorg is an appropriate response, usually in an emergency. But when I go to organizations and I say, how's it going? Oh, we've just come out of a reorg, we're not really sure what we're doing. Or we're just about to go into another reorg. One major bank in the US, I said, these reorgs are happening about every 6 months, and everyone started laughing. And I said, what's funny? They said it's about every 2 or 3 months here. This is not an appropriate response for a day-to-day, quarter-to-quarter business as usual situation. It's a response that is unexpected. It's a response that you have no real other options but to have major reorgs like that. And of course, a reorg creates threat responses. It's unfamiliar. Where am I going to be? What's my role? Am I going to have a role? And a lot of that is unintentionally created within our own organizations, let alone all the disruption and change that's going on outside that we have to deal with. So leadership is not just something you have. It's not something where you can say, oh, I do the same thing and it works all the time. Simon Wardley has done a lot in this space. You go to Wardley Maps and look at a lot of his work. There's a huge amount of value in there. And he says, you know, some of the best leaders in the world, if they were army generals, they'd say, oh, well, I bomb hills. And they say, why do you bomb hills? They say, oh, because I'm a fan of so-and-so. They bomb hills and they're very successful. And that's, you know, that might work out of luck, but it's not leadership. It's copying someone else and not knowing why you're doing it. So the first thing to realize, I think, about leadership is that it is context specific. You need to adapt what you're doing to the context at the time, okay? And leadership is only a part of what we do. As you can see there, we need to have situational awareness of the landscape and what's changing in the landscape that we call the climate. And then we need those day-to-day skills that we would practice on an ongoing basis. And then leadership is just a small part at the end, given all that context. Why do we do this rather than that? Do we make a firm decision and commit to something? Do we try experiments? Do we close the business? Right. The decision of why we do something needs to be based on the context in which we're in. So we need to be aware of the situation and understand what our guiding purpose is. If we don't have a guiding purpose, then we're rather adrift in terms of why we're making decisions that we are. So I want to talk about 3 elements today. Individual leadership, which is one part of it, but it's not the only part. The context in which we make leadership decisions, and then patterns of engagement, which is the real work that I've developed with some colleagues over the last 7 or 8 years to really support engagement, reduce those threats, and create environments where change is more familiar and welcomed. Okay, so the easiest thing we can all do is start where we are. We cannot start anywhere else, even though we might want to, and we can all start with ourselves. All right. So I'm a professional coach, so I did coactive coaching, and they also have a leadership model which works fantastically well. I just rebranded it Agile, as it's easy to do. And the first thing we need to do is start with ourselves. Self-awareness is situational awareness of what's going on within us. And also to empathize and recognize the same is going on in other people. All right. Sometimes we attribute things to other people and say they're not as interested, they're not as skillful, they're not as whatever. But for me, it's the environment. I wasn't given the chance, I didn't have the information. So we tend to see others quite differently from ourselves. So the first thing we can do is be more aware of ourselves and also have greater empathy that other people are going through the same thing. And it's often not in their power to be sort of superhuman people, and that they have the biases and the threats too. So we need to accept ourselves for who we are, let go of our own limiting beliefs. The number of people I talk to and say, "Oh, have you tried this?" and their immediate response is, "We can't do that." I spoke to the CIO of a small, effectively the Asian Netflix. The CIO met him in a coffee shop, saw his logo on his computer, chatted to him, and he said, "Oh, I'm the CIO." I said, "Oh, how do you deliver value? Do you do it continual streams or projects?" And he said, "Oh, I use projects." And I said, "Oh, have you thought about moving to a continual funding basis?" And he said, "I can't do anything about that." 200, 300 person company. And his immediate response was, that's not in my power, that's not in my influence. So understanding ourselves and slowing down and thinking about what we're doing and why are major parts of own development of our own leadership. All right? We'll come to the agile part a bit later. We immediately hit resistance, changing our own identity. Who am I? Am I going to change? Or will I be the same person? Again, we hit these threats and these mind traps on a regular basis. And it's a challenging thing to do individually. So just like a famous support group that gets over alcoholic addiction, the support group, I've discovered, is one of the major factors in successful ways forward. It's perhaps more important than the 12 steps that they have. But the support group to catch each other, to hold each other, to champion each other when we don't see it in ourselves is perhaps the biggest thing we can do. And as leaders of a group, particularly if you're more senior in a formal authority sort of way, you can catch other people and hold them up and identify bias and those sorts of things in your regular day-to-day work, in one-on-ones, in group meetings, and all those sorts of things. Okay? So we can identify these, not try and eliminate them, but just recognize that they're happening and help each other to deal with them a bit better. Then we've got the other common sort of approaches: leading from the front, leading by example. Leading from behind is more of a supporting, coaching role. And then leading from beside, partnering. And I don't think we do a lot of this in organizations. There's a lot of delegation going on. There's a lot of sort of one-to-one interactions. But we don't necessarily say, oh, this person needs some help, so I'll be a bit more sort of leading by example. And then over a period of time with this person, with this activity, we'll start to partner and they can share more responsibility. And over a further period of time, I can take more of a back seat, coach them, start to work. If you've read Turn the Ship Around, that's exactly the sort of approach he was using. And of course, you have to be adaptable because the same person with a different activity may need a different interaction, a different agreement worked with. And working with teams is another situation where you'll have to adapt to the situation. And often it's just about inquiring what the group needs or what the other person needs to know what stance you might want to take. With all of this, we need to appreciate the larger context. We hear stories of major car manufacturers and oil companies and all sorts having negative repercussions outside the organization on the environment, so on and so forth. But using your sort of gut instinct and taking responsibility for the contribution or the larger impact you have in and on the world is an important thing to consider. And again, most of our organizations actually incent us not to do this, to focus on my own KPIs or my own performance appraisal and my chance of promotion, and encourage us to actually work against each other and often work against people outside as well. So it's not that we can do one or the other, or we all have a bias, a preference, a familiarity because we've practiced it and we've got good at it. But the real skill, the real agility in leadership comes from being able to dance between them, to know that there's a bit of this and a bit of that, and now I need to go here and there. And again, as you practice these skills and you get competent and then quite skillful, your agility, your ability to do this starts to become unconscious, and you're really able to focus on the content, on the person, rather than think about these sort of models. Okay? So knowing the context that you're in is important because your ability to interact and adapt to the situation depends on it. Just going through, I'm sure you all know other people who do the same behavior even though it doesn't work. And we all have the same behavior, I know I do, where we do the same thing and a day later or an hour later, I think I've done the same thing over and over and over. Certainly in my coaching practice, my mentors told me multiple times that I was doing the same thing And I didn't think I was, and then I heard a recording of myself. I sounded exactly the same. And it was incredible to hear that. That to me, I was convincing myself I was doing something different. But actually, the hard to argue with recording was telling me otherwise. Right? So context is key. And one way to understand context is a framework called Cynefin. Anyone familiar with Cynefin? Yeah. Okay. So it's a way to understand a situation. 4 main domains. On the right-hand side, we've got order, repeatability, reversibility. We can compound things together. Top left, we've got complex, which are times of uncertainty. We can never gather enough data or have enough time. We're just going to have to take some action, usually in the form of multiple experiments. And then bottom left, we've got chaotic, which is we're never going to be able to learn anything in this space. We probably need to just take action, move somewhere else, and then make some progress. So the main 2 that I want to talk about today are complicated on the top right. Rate of change is low. We can isolate ourselves from change if we want. We have some unknown things, but we know what they are. We can create models. They're useful here because it's fairly stable. This is the realm of consultants, experts, professionals. And we need those. They're all useful in this context. All right. On the left, we've got complex, where the rate of change is high, and we either cannot or don't want to isolate ourselves from change. So that plane that was in the previous diagram, we can isolate ourselves from change by saying we're not going to bring the latest materials, the latest engine technology, the latest aerodynamics into a plane until it's well proven over many years, over many tests and so on. Sometimes we don't have that choice. And so we're in a complex space and we need to behave quite differently. Or we need to figure out how to move it from complex into a complicated so we can apply our expertise in that space. But sometimes we don't have that choice. Right? Brexit is a great example. The more data you gather, the more you try and create certainty. You can't. You just have to decide what you're going to do and then make the best of what you decide. The difficulty with that situation was the question that was asked: should we leave or not? Created that big amount of uncertainty, unfamiliarity, and so on. A threat to, our well-being, our incomes, all those sorts of things. So on this side we have unknown unknowns. We don't know things, but we don't even know what we don't know. The only way to really do this comes back to my first example. When I tried to change an organization, I tried to change it by effectively separating myself from it and saying, we should change it. Whereas when you're in a complex situation, you need to be part of it. If you think of the Einstein experiment of a train passing and sound changing or light changing, it's the difference between being an observer of the train and actually being on the train and being in the middle of it. And the difficulty in these situations, particularly human systems, is that they are adaptive. As soon as you do something, people react, people change. You don't know in what ways, because there are so many different aspects to what causes people to change, that we never get the same opportunity again. So we have to act, and then we have to follow up quickly behind it. So if we come back to that, the Agile Manifesto, where do you think Agile sits on that domain? Is it more complicated and ordered? Is it more complex? Is it somewhere else? The easiest way I do it is it's most appropriate like this. We have to be in it, doing it, which is complex. Helping others do it is also complex. And all the things on the left, all the values on the left, are highly appropriate in a complex space. Working with people, the interactions are extremely important. You need working software. Without it, you can't understand how it works in the current context. You're just guessing. And all the things on the right, we're trying to negotiate a contract, which is a complex activity, but the contract is designed for experts to be able to predict and reduce risk. So we're trying to make it complicated. And the same with documentation and planning and tools and so on. It's a simplification, because actually we need both, and there is a dynamic relationship. We're sometimes in complex, and then we move things to complicated, and then we move them back and back on an ongoing basis. And that's the iteration that we go through, is moving from one space to the other. But we create resistance, again, because it's unfamiliar. That complex space tends to be threatening, because life hasn't been like that until the last 20, 30, 40 years, really, where we're so interconnected, we're so disruptible because of the internet, mobile devices, and communication technology in general, that our brain has not been able to develop, and it still would like most things to be ordered and predictable. So what's the context is key in terms of knowing what to do. Do I change my own behavior in this situation, or do I try and change the situation to be more suitable to our skills, to my skills? All right. So the last part I want to talk about is patterns of engagement. Engagement, when we're talking about change, is really the key. If you look at Gallup's surveys over many years, engagement is down at sort of 13%, and then after about 4 or 5 years of huge investment in engagement, it's gone up to 15%. 1 in 6. Right. Do you know the banks have spent over $1 trillion on improving ways of working and moving towards this? $1 trillion with apparently no measurable results. All right. So here are some things that I think are working. Patterns that tend to cause disengagement are imposition. Anyone been there where your CIO comes in and says, we're going agile? Right. That immediately creates a threat response, because you've created something, given it an identity, and said, effectively, this is more important than you. So everyone has a threat response. My status, my identity is threatened. So we start figuring out, how am I going to defend myself, etc., when we really want to work on how do we all work together. Delegating, we think delegation's good. And in many ways we have to, otherwise we don't have enough time. But there are more effective ways of doing it. And then we talk about things about, unclarity, about authority, and various other things. All of these create resistance, okay, in various forms. And it's not you'll just get one, you'll get autonomy and fairness will come together and cause you to create more, take more control. You'll find that if you work with a team, you want the team to do really well, but you want them to make decisions so that they can succeed. And your desire for progress, your desire for them to agree actually then causes problems. It causes problems in your relationship with them. And sometimes you have to step back from that to let them figure things out themselves. So anyone using Scrum? Yeah. You've got product owners. Product owners, in the Scrum Guide, it says for the product owner to succeed, the entire organization must respect his or her decisions. How many of you in your organizations authorized your product owner to have all the authority over the product? Any hands? Half a hand. We did do it. We didn't clarify the authority. We didn't explicitly agree that. And then we spend months fighting over who has the authority, who's protecting their current status, etc., etc. Scrum Master has something similar. Do you know it says this? It's not just about working with a team and doing sprints and are they having a daily scrum and all those sorts of things. A Scrum Master is supposed to help the rest of the organization understand, create the context where those teams can thrive and have less resistance, have fewer impediments. But we don't authorize them to do that. Or have you? Anyone authorized Scrum Masters, or as a Scrum Master has the authority to coach more senior people People are outside your department? Yeah? One or two? The same thing here with existing roles. Again, we cling to existing roles, and then we don't have clear boundaries of who's authorized to do what. Where does your responsibility for time or task or work, where does it finish and where does someone else begin? So again, we just create resistance. We create resistance for middle managers. Why are middle managers often referred to as the frozen middle? Because they get this message from the top, from a higher status, but they've invested a huge amount to get where they are, and they're hoping to get higher. So they've got a lot invested, a lot to lose, and they're stuck in the middle because the people above them have taken away their autonomy and said this is happening. The people at the bottom who have lower status have often been trained, so they know all the agile terminology, they know what this is and how to do it. And us in the middle, we're left with no status, no knowledge, no familiarity. We've got all these threats. Is it no wonder the natural reaction is to freeze and to try and keep as much as stable as we can? Same for transformation. I mentioned that just now. We create a transformation, we give it an identity, and we just cause problems for ourselves later on. Transformation isn't a thing, it should just be the way we're going. So if we want to improve the way we're working, why not just make it part of everyone's job to help make everyone's job easier, including our own? I don't see that very often. Yeah, Deming talked about it. Deming, who worked with Toyota, his 14 points, point 14, the transformation is everyone's responsibility. And that's been there 35 years or something now. So how do we change? We switch to invitation, we create explicit agreements, and there are patterns, there are examples of this. We've got clean language, we've got core protocols, we've got, for each of these, we've got patterns. You go to the Open Leadership Network website, they're all open source. The reason the Scrum guide is open source is because my colleague Daniel convinced Jeff and Ken to make it open source. Everything we do and work on, we try and make Creative Commons open source. So anyone can use it, work with it, improve it. What we say here is use the best thing you can or better, right? So meetings, for example, we can use interaction protocols. We can use our knowledge about invitation. Would you go to a party where you didn't know who else was invited, what the theme was, how you were expected to behave, those sorts of things? But we do that with meetings quite commonly. And the characteristics of a game, if you've read Reality is Broken, it's a book about if we played more games online, we could solve the world's problems, but we don't play the right games. Games have a goal, rules, a way of gauging progress or the state of play, and opt-in participation. And any sports game, any game of chess or anything has all these. But in our meetings, we often don't have a clear goal. It's muddled, that we're sharing information, trying to make decisions, and various other things. The rules by which we play are made up, or it depends who's hosting the meeting. We don't often have a way to gauge how well we're doing. Often if the goals are not clear, we couldn't do that anyway. Many meetings are mandatory. Now it's not exclusive, we have a mixture, but that tends to be how it goes. When I do workshops, when I do courses, it tends to be that there's a bit of flexibility for some people, but we can just expand that to do more. The other thing about meetings is, just like roles, if we get very specific with roles, we end up with lots and lots of specialist roles, we end up with lots and lots of specialist meetings, and we end up with more meetings than we can deal with. I've met so many people who have back-to-back meetings all through the day. So just manage your time a bit better, start 5 minutes later, end 5 minutes earlier. If you can do it in anything in 50 minutes, you can do in an hour really. But also find ways to consolidate your meetings. And many organizations have a meeting for a few people to talk about the customer. Then we have another group to talk about product management. And then we have another group to talk about analysis. And actually, if we just had meetings with a few more people, we could end up with half the number of meetings. And a lot of the problems would go away. It builds on some of those patterns I was talking about. It's based on invitation. So people who really don't find it valuable wouldn't need to show up. We're creating common knowledge. We're increasing the knowledge, the interaction, stimulating network connection, the possibility of new and unusual ideas from being discovered. And open space agility is just a big form of that. If you haven't heard of open space, it's used at conferences a lot. We use it internally. It's usually got a very high-level sponsor, ideally the CEO, someone like that, who authorizes everyone who turns up to share as much as they can. We turn that into action. It's great to use it as a sort of quarterly planning and review cycle. It's effectively organizational development. It's the same as iterative development for a product, but we just use it on our culture, if you like. Okay? So my question to you after I finish and before the Q&A is, where do you encounter resistance? And also, what do you resist and why? Okay. So thank you.